What's up, JEFusion fans? This is Philip, and welcome back to another video. So, exactly 8 years ago on this day, at least as of the recording of this video, we lost Dan, aka GekiDan, the creator of JEFusion. And it's been, I think, a personal tradition of mine to have at least a single post or a single video dedicated to Dan in commemoration of his life. Now, this video isn't exactly about Dan himself, but I'd like to talk about something that Dan and I have in common, that we are 90's kids. We were 90's kids. Although Dan himself was born a bit later in the 1980s, but we basically grew up, in the same generation. And I just thought that I would talk about the kind of experiences that Dan and I had, or at least what I think we would have in common way back in the 1990's. The things we enjoyed and how it relates to us being a part of JEFusion now. I mean, uh, I know it's been years since Dan left this world, but uh, for me, I do believe that he's still part of the team, and I think that he'll forever be. So, with that said, let's begin this video. So, growing up in the 90's, I think it was the golden age of anime and tokusatsu in the Philippines. So, by the way, if there are any people watching from the Philippines, especially if you're a 90's kid, leave a comment down below. Now, of course, this video is going to be completely in English because I do want audiences of from other countries to understand how we grew up in the 90's in the Philippines. So, what kind of experiences did we have? So, if you happen to be watching from outside of the Philippines, you're not Filipino. Uh, I know that um, if you're watching this channel, basically, you probably grew up in the 90's as well, appreciating basically the same stuff that we had. So, even though if you're not Filipino, at least you're a 90's kid that grew up with the Japanese pop culture. uh, I guess you can also leave a comment down below. Share your experiences with us because I would love to learn what you guys have in your country during that time. So again, if you're either a Filipino, if you were a Filipino kid in the 90's, just like me and Dan, or at least a 90's kid from another country, but you grew up, uh, you know, enjoying the same stuff that I'm going to talk about in this video. So leave a comment down below. Yeah. So like I've been saying earlier, I believe uh, it was the best time for a Filipino kid to be a fan of anime and tokusatsu. And I think I could safely assume, perhaps, that most of the 90's kids in the Philippines, I believe, I'd call ourselves like the anime generation. Like, we were the ones that really grew up on anime, although technically anime has been, in the Philippines far before 1990s. At least in the 1970s, like the earliest animes to be shown in the Philippines began, but I don't have any clear idea on that. I may have read some things, but not really in very much detail. But nonetheless, definitely from speaking from my experience, by the way, 1990's definitely was a great time. Now, uh, particularly, like I've said, like in the aspect of anime and tokusatsu, like a lot of popular animes that we know, of course, until today, we have already seen way back in the 1990s. However, from what I, as far as I can recall, a lot of them, of course, have been English dubbed. However, the voice actors are definitely Filipino. So, what basically happened was, of course, TV channels, TV stations would have various TV stations, basically, not just a single channel, had probably purchased the rights to air certain shows, again, like anime or tokusatsu, and then have them dubbed in either English or uh, Tagalog, especially in much later years, so that the Filipino audiences would understand. Now, speaking of so let's talk about animes that were aired in the Philippines first in the 1990s. I probably wouldn't be able to talk about all of them, but definitely some of the more popular shows that uh, I would say that were aired. Now, uh, I remember watching Tosho Daimas, part of the Robot Romance trilogy. So it was basically back, I think, in either 1994, 95, or 96, as far as I can remember. And it was definitely an English dubbed version. There would be a Tagalog dub version much later, also in the 90s, but that's the earliest that I can remember watching Daimos. So, uh, Voltus 5 uh, was actually more of a resurgence in the 1990s, especially I think it was around 1999 that Voltus 5 actually came back to Philippine television after almost 20 years. Now, that one I can talk about in a separate video, although there's a lot of politics involved in that. But I still do think that it's a nice piece of history. But nonetheless, uh, Combattler V Mazing. Now, Mazinger Z was supposed to be aired on the same channel that aired Daimos, Voltus 5, and Combattler V, but for some reason, it never came out. So probably there's a lot of cut content. So it eventually was scrapped, although it was heavily advertised. So yeah, and Yu Yu Hakusho, or if you're from the Philippines, you would probably know it better as Ghost Fighter. Yeah, and because at that time, uh, now I still distinctly remember that it was dubbed in Tagalog, but the characters, however, have been changed to English, or the characters' names, to be precise, have been changed to English. Let's say, for example, Yusuke Urameshi uh, came to be known as Eugene in the Filipino dub. So, uh, Kuwabara was called Alfred, Hiei was called Vincent, and Kurama was called Dennis. And one of the most popular characters, or villains rather, was the younger Toguro, or well, the Toguro brothers. But for some reason, they, or probably a mispronunciation that kind of stuck for the entirety of the dub, they became Taguro. Although it is a possible name in Japanese, possible family name, but nonetheless, it was originally Toguro in the Japanese version, but for some reason they became Taguro in the Filipino dub, and until now, there's quite a popular meme about it, and that also I uh, would like to talk about in a future video. So yeah, those kinds of animes that we kind of grew up with. Of course, who could not mention Dragon Ball Z, right? Uh, it's I believe the earliest that I've seen it was around 95 or 96, but it was an English dub version. It would resurface a few years later, but in the early 2000s, it would resurface, but that would be dubbed in Tagalog that time around. But originally, when I saw Dragon Ball, it was dubbed in English. So at least those were some of the uh, very popular animes that I remember growing up watching. Definitely not all of them, or I couldn't rather I couldn't say everything, because that this video would be far too long if I enumerate all of the other animes that uh, I grew up watching way back in the 1990s. Now, moving on to tokusatsu. Okay, for any Filipino kid growing up in the 90s, or even if you were born like in the later part of the 1980s, probably even 80s, but nonetheless, you were still, I understand, you're still quite young in the 90s. So, as for tokusatsu in that era, it's a hodgepodge of basically every tokusatsu that has been known to, uh, you know, has been known to man. Now, for the Filipino kids in the 90s, I think at least two tokusatsu shows would be very monumental in their lives. It's Hikari Sentai Mask Man and Kamen Rider Black. So they were both aired on the same channel, weekend afternoons. Although I think Mask Man came out on TV first, because the earliest I can remember watching Mask Man on TV was way back in 1992. Now, I could be wrong, but I still remember that I was around 2 years old when I first saw Masked Man on TV. And like I've said, a lot during that time, a lot of the Japanese characters were changed to more English sounding names. Let's say, for example, Red Mask Takeru, his name was changed to Michael Joe. So, of course, also the rest of the Masked Men were uh, changed to English sounding names as well. But I think the most striking thing about Masked Man during those days is that uh, not only, of course, was the language changed to Tagalog, the names of the characters changed to English, but the theme song itself was in Tagalog as well. That's why I think it stuck with a lot of Filipinos, because all the changes made to the show were attempts to make the story at least fit just a little bit more into the Filipino culture. I think the same, not really the same thing was done to Kamen Rider Black, but there have been some changes. Now the theme song was retained. The Japanese theme song was retained. However, the characters were kind of changed as well, especially with the main character Kotaro Minami. So instead of him and Nobuhiko Akizuki being stepbrothers, they were dubbed to be actual brothers, and actually even twins in the Filipino version, with Kotaro changed to Robert Akizuki. So yes, Kotaro was Nobuhiko's brother, quote unquote, in the Filipino dub of Masked Rider Black. So there you go. That's another thing that uh, stuck with me as a 90s kid, is that we are used to calling Kamen Riders Masked Riders. But then again, it's a literal translation, right? Kamen means mask, masked rider. I mean, the same thing, uh, you know, was done in the English adaptation of Kamen Rider Black RX. So now we are going to move on to Western tokusatsu, particularly particularly the ones that were made by Saban Entertainment. Now, actually, uh, it was in 1994 that the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers started airing in the Philippines. So I would remember that because I started going to preschool at that time, and definitely uh, it was a show that changed my life. I mean, sure, I have seen shows like Mask Man before, but Power Rangers, because it was already like an English, uh, speaking show, there was really no need to dub it. The English language was very much kept, although later seasons would be dubbed into Tagalog instead. I don't mind that change, but even so, like at least to me, it made little to no difference other than the language, you know. But again, I grew up watching Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and at least until Turbo. So yeah, so at least those seasons were aired in the Philippines. Although I kind of lost interest in the Power Rangers because of how it ended, because they stopped with Turbo. And if you know the ending of Power Rangers Turbo, it ended in the defeat of the Power Rangers, which is why I, to be completely honest, I hated the Power Rangers because of that. Or at least uh, I hated that they ended Power Rangers on that note. They never aired Power Rangers in Space, which I think would have been a good finale to air, at least in the Philippines, even if they no longer had to, let's say, air everything in between, or yeah, like everything after Power Rangers in Space. I still think that Power Rangers in Space, like at least, for the Zordon era of the Power Rangers, it would have been a nice ending, but we never got that. Still disappointed, really. But of course, uh, going back, so more Japanese tokusatsu, I think I did forget to mention though, sorry. We also had Metal Heroes, specifically the space sheriff shows like Gavan. However, we never got Sharivan, but we did get Shider. So where is Sharivan? We never knew. However, Shider went on to become the most popular metal hero in the Philippines. In fact, in 2007, there was there was a show that was basically made to be a sequel of Shider, although Toei wasn't really involved, but they did give permission to that channel to make a spin-off series based on Shider. So the main protagonists were basically descendants or basically grandchildren of Shider. But yeah, that was the case. I could talk that one. I probably could talk about in another video as well. So we did have other metal heroes like the Rescue Police trilogy. I still remember seeing like Winspector, uh, Soul Brain, and even Winspector. I forgot the other one. Exceed Draft. I do vaguely remember seeing it on TV, but definitely like Winspector and Soul Brain I remember quite well. And speaking of Metal Heroes, of course, we also had the American versions. Well, at least I definitely remember VR Troopers uh, and the Big Bad Beetleborgs. So I loved that show so much when I was a kid. Yeah, and I think uh, it was just it was weird, but I do love it. So yeah, because of those shows, basically, whether it's anime, tokusatsu, really, uh, it kind of made me into who I am and why I'm a part of this uh, group in JEFusion, and definitely it led me to meeting Dan eventually. So again, because of what we shared, how we grew up, what we had in common, what we enjoyed growing up, I think I could say that it was destiny that Dan and I would eventually meet and I'd become a part of JEFusion. So that I think that's it for today's video. I I do have a lot more things to talk about, really, but I'm afraid this video is gonna get too long. But again, if you're either a 90s kid growing up in the Philippines or you know, even countries other than the Philippines that happen to, have the same stuff that we had growing up. So share your stories down in the comment section. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Please do leave a like, comment, share this video, subscribe, and don't forget that notification bell so you get the latest from JEFusion. This has been Philip, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Thank you, Dan.